We're trying to start off our study of Judogatami by dividing 4 mechanical areas of which you must become a master. The first was the mechanics of control, and we've seen that the shoulder is your primary focus here. We saw also the mechanics of the position, where our primary focus was staying on top and the ability to recover if we get put on bottom. Then we looked at the mechanics of braking, and we saw that the right rule is the basis of our study of the mechanics of braking. Now we're going to go into the 4th mechanical aspect, which you must become a master of. And this is the mechanics of separation. You must have the ability to separate your opponent's defensive arms. Okay. For those of you who watched my leg lock video, you will probably remember me saying that whenever you go to lock one of your opponent's legs, 95% of the resistance comes from the other leg. Exactly the same thing is true with Judogatami. If I go to break my opponent's right arm, 90% of the initial resistance will come from his left arm. So learning to separate our opponent's arms so we can go into a break is a huge part of your development in this aspect of Judogatami training. So once we come in on our opponent, we've controlled our shoulder, we've gotten our top position, and we're confident we've got the ability to break someone's arm, you've got to be able to separate his arms. Okay, he knows there's no secret as to what's about to happen, and he knows damn well what an armbar is. He knows he's in trouble, and he's going to hang on for dear life. And I have to be able to separate his arms against strong resistance. The question is, how are we going to do this in a way which keeps us in a strong breaking position? If I could literally sit here all day and show you methods of separating arms. Okay, there's literally dozens upon dozens of methods, and almost all of them are effective and work well. I'm not going to bore you with a huge number of methods. I'm going to show you some of my favorite methods, but more importantly, I'm going to give you the conceptual apparatus to be able to improvise, because that's important. Sometimes you have opponents who do things you didn't expect in this position, and some of my personal favorite ways of opening up my opponent's arms and separating them so I can get through to the break. Okay, let's start off with a general observation. How I go to separate my opponent's arms is almost entirely bound up with how is he holding his arms. Okay, I can't say there's any one method which will get you around my opponent's locked arms, which will unlock any set of locked arms. Your ability to unlock arms is rather like your ability to get through a door with a key. Okay, there's a key for every lock, and just because a key works on this door doesn't mean it's going to work on that door. So too, when my arms are locked up like so, a grip break that works well on one grip is not necessarily going to work on another grip. So let's focus first on some conceptual elements when we go to work in this position and look to separate his hands, and then some practical elements on what we do per lock. First, let's understand the different possibilities. Your opponent can lock 10 fingers, like so. He can lock palm to palm, like so. He can lock wrist to wrist, like so. He can lock figure of 4, like so. And he can go with tucked figure of 4, where he tucks his hand underneath with a figure of 4. Okay, so once again, my opponent can go with a 10-finger grip. He can go with a palm-to-palm grip. He can go with a wrist-to-wrist grip. He can go with a figure 4 grip. And he can put the figure of 4 underneath my leg. What's the purpose of that? If he puts the figure of 4 underneath the leg, he can interfere with my cross-face leg and take it off. So it's not a bad idea on his part. Okay, there's good and bad to every single one of those locks. They all have their good points and they all have their bad points. Typically, some athletes will favor one over another. Okay, and you should be able to cope with any one of them. Let's first just look at some conceptual elements here. Let's start with, say, a palm-to-palm grip. That's a fairly common grip that we often have to work with. Some first things first. One of the first questions I ask is, how much exposure between my opponent's hands and his chest is there in whatever grip he's using? That's the first thing I look for. My opponent's hands can be on his chest. That presents one kind of problem. Or his hands can be off his chest. That presents a different kind of problem. Okay? Different locks will create different scenarios. If my opponent elects to go for figure 4 locks, it's almost impossible for him to put his hands on his own chest. Okay? If my opponent goes 10 finger, it's really easy for him to put his hands on his own chest, but it tends to come with all kinds of crazy elbow exposure problems as well. Okay, so you can start to see the first question I ask myself is, how far are his hands from his chest? And that will vary according to which lock he's using. Okay. Second, is my cross-face leg under any kind of threat? If the hands are locked, like so, clearly they are. Now he can push, and I've lost my cross-face. Okay. Next question I ask is my torso leg under any kind of threat? If my opponent gets his elbow underneath and starts pushing my torso leg between his legs, clearly I'm losing control on that torso leg. So I always ask, is either my crossface or my torso leg under threat from my opponent's arm position? Okay, so those are the first three things I ask. Where are his hands in relation to the chest? Is there space between the two? Are my legs under threat from his defensive arms? Those are my first three questions. And how I start to act is based on my responses to those questions. Okay, so we go to work in this situation. I see my opponent's taking a 10-finger grip. Okay, here's the thing I want to avoid more than anything else. Okay, and sadly you see this even at World Championship level. I never want to lock up elbow to elbow on either side of my opponent and go back in straight lines. I don't care how strong you are not strong enough to pull someone's arm out of their socket, because that's in fact what you're trying to do when you use this method. Okay, Placido locks up tight. It doesn't matter what his lock is, you are condemning yourself to failure if you just start falling back in straight lines. Okay, elbow to elbow is not going to separate anybody's hands, even when they are much smaller and weaker than you are. Okay, so that's what not to do. We never lock up and go back in straight lines. Okay, now elbow to elbow is a disaster when we go back in a straight line, but elbow to wrist is a winning formula. What we want to do, as much as possible, is take my opponent's elbow away from my center line. Okay, the looser my opponent's grip, the easier this is to accomplish. So for example, 10-finger grips, palm to palm, and wrist to wrist are all good grips where I can take my opponent's elbow away from the center line. However, if my opponent locks figure of 4, this becomes much more difficult. Okay, so when I see loose grips, 10-finger, palm to palm, wrist to wrist, my first action is always to bring his elbow under an armpit and away from the center line. If I see my opponent has a very tight figure of 4 grip, then I will stay on the center line, and I'll show you the grip breaks that I use from there shortly. However, if my opponent's in like so, one of my first opening gambits is to go forward and take the elbow to the armpit, and I start working at the wrist. I bring my elbow away from his elbow, and I bring the elbow to the wrist. Okay, that's where I want to put all my pressure on. I don't care whether it's this elbow or this elbow. I always want to work elbow to wrist as much as possible, okay, regardless of which side we're on. Okay, again, in loose grips such as 10-finger, palm to palm, and wrist to wrist, we want to get the elbow away from the center line. If we pull on the center line, you'll never separate anybody's arms. Elbow to elbow on the center line is just a disaster. Okay, so we're always looking to bring the elbows away from the center line. Now, with everything locked up in place like so, elbow off the center line, I'm elbow to wrist instead of elbow to elbow. And from situations like this, it's very easy for me to pitch over to a given side and separate my training partner's arms. Okay, once we get the separation we're looking for, we never try to break with our elbows over our training partner's wrists. Always we come in 2-on-1. 2-on-1 using the thumbs enables us to direct his hand, right hand to right armpit, and as a result we get the braking mechanics that we're looking for, and we get the strong breaks that we want out of this position. Okay, so loose grips, which are defined as 10-finger, palm to palm, and wrist to wrist. Okay, any one of those, our intention is to get the elbow off the center line and across to an armpit. Our intention is to get elbow to wrist instead of elbow to elbow. Okay, elbow to elbow is not going to separate any one of these locks, but elbow to wrist will separate almost all of them. Okay. When we come up, let's make sure we never go wrist to wrist. It's always the elbow to wrist in place like so. Okay. I have the choice of falling in either direction, so long as we're elbow to wrist. Okay. And from here, it's so easy to get the separation. Once we get the separation, we never satisfy ourselves here. Always we control two hands on one. Okay. So that we control the direction of the thumb. If I hold like so, the thumb is not directed, it's not controlled, and he can turn and start to spin out. So we always want to control our training partner's wrist in like so. When he goes to move away from me, it's so difficult, and you have excellent control over him. And from here, I simply raise the height of the fulcrum, and we get our braking mechanics. Okay. Now, if my opponent has a tighter grip in this situation, so he's elected to go into figure 4 grips. Now, moving the elbow across the center line is not going to happen. Okay. The first thing I start to look at in situations like this is, where is the strength of my opponent's grip? You'll see that a large percentage of it is tied up with your opponent's fingers. The fingers around the triceps are an obvious source of weakness. Okay. When I feed a hand in under these circumstances, the sport of jiu-jitsu does not allow me to grab any 1, 2, or 3 digits. That is illegal. However, it is fully legal for me to grab the knuckle line, and that's exactly what I do. I grab right there at the knuckle line. Let's go this way so the camera can see. There's Placido's knuckle line. Okay. Again, it's illegal for me to start grabbing at fingers. However, there's nothing to stop me grabbing the knuckle line. When Placido holds on as tight as he can, it's so easy to peel everything away. And what do we do now? We go in, we get elbow to wrist. Okay, so there's his grip. Okay, I go through, I identify the knuckle line and expose it. So I can come up, and now once again, we're elbow to wrist. When he goes to move out of here, it's so difficult, and now we've got true control over our training partner. There's the grip that we favor, and now we're in a winning position. Okay, so when I see a figure of 4 in this situation, look out, my first target is the knuckle line, because all of his strength comes in his fingers. Here I can't separate. I go forward, and it's so easy, and I've exposed the wrist. There's the wrist. We go back. Once we get the straightening out effect, look how we catch, everything goes across. There's the high fulcrum, and we get a good finish as a result. Now, let's add some more elements here. If I see my opponent put his hand underneath and tuck the figure of 4 in these situations, his intention here is pretty clear. He wants to use this to remove my cross-face leg. Okay, a few simple things here. First, one very simple counter is for me to place my hand wrist deep with a false grip over my training partner's wrist, and from there have the confidence to pluck his hand out and then return back where we came from. Once we get into this situation, look, I take my hand through and I put my hand inside his 2 hands. Okay, hold tight. So I just bring my thumb all the way inside, and once again we're elbow to wrist, always working that elbow to wrist situation. So he starts off with the hand tucked underneath, just like so. Okay, I bring my hand through, and then from here, look how I just straighten out my leg and replace my cross-face leg. I bring everything forward, and my hand emerges inside. So once again, we're elbow to wrist. Now from this position, as always, we've got to straighten out our training partner. There's that 2-handed grip that we always favor. There's the high fulcrum, and there's the braking position. If, for whatever reason, I see this is going to be a difficult thing for me to achieve, another one which I often favor in these situations is to prop on our training partner's elbow and thread my leg over his elbow, just like so. Lock tight. Now, from here, we just use this to clear away our training partner's arm, and once again, the legs are out of position and ready to be attacked. So he's underneath and controlling me, just like so. I just take my cross-face leg over his elbow joint. I lock the figure of 4 and separate his 2 arms. Now from here, when we come up, we're in the perfect position to go back. You also have other options here in terms of just placing your foot inside, second foot in, and getting the separation you want, and going back to a winning position. Obviously, you also have some triangle options there too, if you go back to the triangle video. So once again, we have an opponent locked up like so. Look how I just bring my cross-face leg inside his elbow joint. I lock the figure of 4, and now it's very easy to separate his two arms. And then from this position, it's relatively simple for us. Go through and start attacking the wrist. But always remember the broad principle of go in and attack elbow to wrist, never elbow to elbow in a straight line. Okay? Elbow to elbow in a straight line will never separate anyone's hands, regardless of grip. Okay? However, if we work in situations where elbow to wrist, even when he locks his hands, it means very little. Okay? You will always be able to take his arm into something like an American lock position, where it's structurally very, very weak. Okay? That elbow to wrist position, regardless of which side we employ it on, is always what we're looking for. It's a Kimura on one side and an American lock on the other. And that is always the position that we're looking to separate our training partner's hands. And from here, we go to a two-handed grip, never being satisfied with this kind of thing, where the thumb is not controlled. Always from here, our primary thing is to control the thumb and keep the right hand over the right armpit and get a nice high fulcrum for our breaks. So the first critical principle is always going to be that elbow to wrist rather than elbow to elbow in straight lines. We're always looking to create a situation where my opponent's arm is put into something like an American lock or a Kimura lock. Okay? That means that his elbow is going to have to move off the center line. Okay? This is particularly applicable in situations where my opponent uses palm to palm, 10 finger, and wrist to wrist grips. Okay? Any one of these situations, it's not difficult for us to get into that winning position. Okay? And from here, we go through and we get very strong breaks. If my opponent goes to a figure 4 grip, from here we've seen one of the great weaknesses of this particular figure 4 is this, the knuckle line. And that will always create exposure of my opponent's wrist to my elbow. And as a result, we can start to get the separation we want for strong finishes. If my opponent tucks the figure of 4 in here, we can either expose wrist to elbow like so, or expose wrist and elbow like so. And in this way, we make use of this critical wrist to elbow principle instead of the disastrous elbow to elbow principle. Now let's go further into this idea of separating our opponent's arms. If we have an opponent down in the Judikatari position, let's understand something. You're fighting against a very strong structural position. We've just made a criticism of the idea that most people have a natural tendency to lock up elbow to elbow and fall back in straight lines, and that will never lead to success on anyone with any kind of skill level. Just because you're literally pulling into your opponent's strength. Even someone significantly smaller and weaker than yourself could stop you if you use this method. What we need to do is create some kind of mechanical weakness on his part and mechanical advantage on ours. Probably the easiest way for us to create mechanical advantage is to create a situation where my opponent's arm is locked out at 90 degrees, either in the shape of an American lock or in the shape of a Kimura lock. And then we apply forces at the end of the lever, elbow to wrist, never at the start of the lever, elbow to elbow. Okay? So one of our primary goals is always to turn our opponent's arm into either an American lock or a Kimura lock. Now, a natural question to ask is, how are you going to do that? Okay? We can only really realistically do that in situations where my opponent employs either a 10-finger grip, a palm-to-palm grip, or a wrist-to-wrist grip. If your opponent has elected to go into a figure 4 grip, it's unlikely you're going to be able to get these full Kimura and American lock situations. So we tend to use them more in situations where they're, say, palm-to-palm or 10-finger. I'll demonstrate them out of a palm-to-palm grip, but they would work equally well for 10-finger or wrist-to-wrist as well. Okay, first, my opponent's elbow's on my center line and we've locked up. We've got to do something to take him offline. So I put my hand in, just like so, and I pull his elbow to my armpit and I bring my elbow up to his wrist. Now I'm going to take a trick. I'm going to put my elbow over my own thigh. Let's move around this way, press again. I don't just want to be able to move his arm in place. I want to be able to keep it in place once I've moved it there. Okay? So I come in, just like so, and I put my elbow over my own thigh, so that when he tries to return his arm back to a safe position, it's very, very difficult. My thigh is stopping him. If I move my opponent's arm and just hold it here, and he's strong, he's going to pull my elbow back to center line. Okay? So once I move, I block it with my own thigh. Okay? Now I move my chest away, and I put my elbow on top of his elbow, so that we create something like an American lock. Now I lock my hands palm to palm. As Placido holds on as tight as he can, I'm going to push with my right elbow and pull with my left and separate. Now, immediately, I've got to go back to control the elbow. Okay? If I stay here, his elbow is free. He can start to slip the elbow inside my thigh. And then all your good work is undone. Okay? So once again, we start off with everything on the center line. I put my hand and elbow in place and take everything off. I put my elbow over my own thigh so that I lock it in place. Now I put my forearm over his elbow. I lock palm to palm and I apply something like an American lock. Immediately I go into the elbow. So when he tries to twist the elbow through, it's controlled. Now I take his right hand to my right armpit. As always, two hands go on. I raise the height of the fulcrum and we're in the perfect position to get our breaking finish. Once again, my opponent's in place. I want to start by pulling his elbow off the center line. Then I go elbow to wrist and bring my elbow over my own thigh. Now I come forward, elbow to elbow, and we lock up. From this position, we get tremendous ability to separate his hands. Now I immediately go through and control the elbow joint. And as a result, we can take the arm away, I catch and transfer his hand across my body so that the right hand goes to my right armpit. Then I bring my foot back, my second foot comes on, so we've got a high level, we've got scissored legs. Rather than squeeze my knees together, I want my legs scissoring. And from here he tries to move away and finds it almost impossible. And then we have a very strong break for the finish. Now, what about the Kimura lock? How are we going to get there? That's going to require you to climb onto your opponent's body. I'm going to take my hand through and I'm going to put my hand on my own thigh. I'm going to retract my legs just like so, and I'm going to use my left foot to climb up on top of my training partner's body. From this position, I'm going to go elbow to wrist, just like so, and my hand stays on my own thigh. Now from here, I sweep everything around. My head goes from over his torso to outside his thigh, and it separates the arms very, very easily. It's like his arm has been put in a Kimura lock. Don't try and do it elbow to elbow. Make a strong arm. You'll never separate him here. I always want to go to the end of the lever, elbow to wrist, and then everything goes around the corner and separates. We go down to the mat, and there's our break. So once again, the two choices to create mechanical advantage are to put your opponent in either an American lock or a Kimura. As he locks up tight, and I notice that his grip is one where there's play in the arms, so it's a non-figure four grip. Look how I take his elbow off the center line and lock. There's the American and the finish. For the Kimura, I climb onto his body so that my head is over his hips. I bring everything down elbow to wrist, and then my head rotates so that we isolate his arm courtesy of that Kimura. Then from here, the usual finishing position. In this way, we can create something like 2 locks at the same time, an American lock or a Kimura to separate his hands, and a Jujigatami to actually break the elbow. Now, let's go further into this mechanics of separation, how to separate our opponent's 2 defensive arms. We're looking at the idea that 95% of your opponent's initial resistance to the Jujigatami is going to come from the other arm. So if you're threatening his right arm, it's the left arm, which is going to make things difficult to actually get to the break. What we're trying to give you is a concepts-powered way of looking at this general scenario. Rather than me sitting here and showing you my favorite ways of separating arms, we're trying to give you broad concepts to work with and then illustrate the concepts with some practical examples. The first big concept we saw was the idea of avoiding elbow to elbow on the center line. We always want to be elbow to wrist, moving away from the center line. We also looked at the element of turning our opponent's arm into either an American lock or a Kimura, and thereby weakening the structure of his defensive position and enabling us to separate the arms. Let's look now at a third principle, attacking the other arm. This is kind of like the arm equivalent of double trouble. Your opponent has 2 arms. We know that 90% of the resistance comes from the other arm, so we go in and we control that one. And as a result, we can confound our opponent's defenses. This tactic is often something we'll make use of. I'll demonstrate it in various kinds of grips. We know that we're attacking our opponent's right arm. We know that 95% of his defense, at least initially, comes from the left. One thing we can often get into a habit of is tying up the far arm. Now, understand something. I'm trying to pull his right wrist towards me. So what's stopping me is that left elbow pulling back. Okay, as we get into a tug of war, I'm pulling this way, his left elbow moves that way, and you can see we're involved in this tug of war based around the left elbow. Okay, so if I can go in on my training partner and pull the left elbow forwards, that's going to make it very easy for me to take his elbow out of position and get his elbow off the center line, get my elbow up to his wrist. Okay, so here we are, we're elbow to elbow. I go forward on my training partner and I cup the far tricep and I pull the elbow in towards me, and that makes it very easy for me to gain that American lock position that we're always looking for. Okay, now from here, as everything ties up, we're in the perfect position to go back and separate our training partner's hands, get 2 hands on one wrist, and get into a strong breaking position. Okay, so once again, we're here locked up with our training partner in the elbow to elbow situation. He locks in tight, and from here I go forward and I take away his defensive arm, take it out of position, and now we're in the perfect situation to go through and separate his arms. Even if my opponent locks the figure of 4, we can do similar things. Look how by going forward on my training partner and drawing the far arm in, it becomes possible for me now to penetrate at the wrist, and from here, once again, we find ourselves in a winning situation. So this is something I will often make use of. Okay, I'm pulling away on the near arm and doing nothing on the far arm, and as a result, I'm not effective in these situations. But the moment I start coming in and putting pressure on that far arm, now we can start to come up into mechanically efficient situations where I'm attacking the wrist instead of the elbow. So regardless of how he goes into lock, okay, we're always looking to draw that far elbow into a position of weakness and create the kinds of attacks that we favor, elbow to wrist. Okay. We can attack the far arm simply by hugging it, like so. Okay. It's also possible in these situations to go over the top and get grips inside our training partner's arm, like so, and separate my training partner's arms into other kinds of lock. Whether I go wrap around grips, like so, or whether I just go with conventional grips, like so. These are very, very effective methods for us to go in and start separating our training partner's arms. Okay. Again, it's based on the simple insight that 95% of the initial resistance to an armbar is always going to come from the opposite arm. If I'm attacking the right, it's going to come from the left. Okay. Most of the time, we just use simple methods of pulling. Okay, but we can also use methods where we go around the corner, like so, and get into strong breaks. Even when my opponent has the figure of 4 underneath my leg, even from here, we can still make good use of this principle of pulling out on my training partner's far arm and weakening the various grips that he employs and creating the American lock, which will facilitate the separation of his arms and a strong break. Now let's go on to a fourth general conceptual principle to separate our opponent's arms. This is the use of our legs to separate his arms. Let's have a look at this now. From a Judogatame situation, we can often make use of our legs to separate his arms. Okay, let's say for example my opponent has a grip in like so. From here, I will often look at the manner in which my opponent is locking his arms, and I will start to assess what is the space between his hands and his chest, okay? Because that will often determine how I go to use my legs. So for example, look how I take my knee and I put it inside his bicep, and as a result I can thread a foot inside the shoulder and bicep like so. Then I can bring my second foot in and form an X shape on my training partner. My toes point back towards each other, and as a result we can quickly start to separate our training partner's arms and lock out in the usual fashion. From here we make a simple adjustment and we're back in a winning position. Why is this working so well? It's working because there's a big space inside my training partner's upper arms, and into that space we can easily thread our legs. Look how I start off with my legs kinked in the usual fashion, just like so, and now I bring my foot back in and make an initial hook. Then my second leg comes in and hooks into the armpit. As my two knees splay apart, my two toes pointing in together, it's quite a simple thing for me now to use the pressure of my legs to separate my training partner's arms. And from here we get excellent results. Another simple way we can use our legs. This one I will tend to use more when my opponent has his hands locked palm to palm. Very often from here in the past, we saw the idea of going down to a shoulder and gripping my training partner around the leg. As he tries to fight his way back up to his base, I'm going to bring my elbow to his wrist. Okay? I let him come up a certain distance. And then right about here, right on the cusp of this 45-degree angle, I just violently open my knee. I'm not kicking him, because I'm already in contact with his head and face with my leg. But I just open my knee, and as a result, we quickly separate his hands and go into a winning position. This is particularly useful when we're already up here like so, with my elbow around my training partner's wrist. So I go down like so, and I see my opponent fighting his way up to top position. He thinks, oh, I'm almost there, almost there. At the 45-degree mark, look how my left knee, cross-face leg, opens. And it separates his hands, and we go directly into a win. Another simple way in which you can use your legs to separate your opponent's arms, let's move around this way, pass it down, is to use the cross-face leg. Often what I'll do is I'll sit down on my elbow, just like so, as we so often do, and as I see my opponent coming up, I'm going to use a kind of a vibrating motion of my leg to just quickly separate my training partner's arms. The key here is not to violently kick on your opponent. Rather, it's to engage in a small series of shocks. Each successive shock dislodges your hands a little more than the previous one. So as he makes strong grips, strong arm, etc., etc., from here I just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 until the hands separate. And then from here we quickly get a good result. Once again, my opponent comes up and we start this action of small shifting shocks until the hands separate. We bring everything in and lock up in the usual fashion. In this way, we can often use our legs to be successful. Now, so far, most of what we've done has involved situations where there was separation of my opponent's hands from his chest. What if my opponent locks his hands and brings the hands down to the chest? Okay, so now it's very hard for me to get my feet underneath and use my legs in the usual fashion. No problem. Whenever we see hands down on the chest, we lock a triangle directly over the hands. Okay. Once we do this, it puts tremendous pressure on my training partner's wrists, and as a result, when we sit back, we end up at an excellent opportunity to go into simple triangle attacks. So here we are, we have a basic Judogatame position. Look how I just bring my foot directly over my training partner's hands. Okay. Now from here, I lock the figure of 4. It goes right over my training partner's hands, and now we're in the perfect position to separate the arms and find ourselves in a win situation. This is particularly useful anytime your opponent's grip goes down to the chest. If the hands are up, then it would be more appropriate to use the various other methods we've looked at. But whenever I see my opponent drag his hands down to his chest, this is an excellent way for us to act. Foot goes directly over the top, the triangle goes in place, and we get a nice finish. Okay? In this way, we can use our legs to separate our opponent's hands very effectively. Now, in my Jujutami system, a big part when it's time to separate our opponent's arms, he's defending himself, he knows he's in danger, he's defending himself. A big part of what I try to coach is the idea of getting away from elbow to elbow grips, which are good for controlling people, and getting to elbow to wrist grips, which are good for separating arms. Ultimately, what I want you guys to do is create a situation where you create what we call the cross chest position, where your opponent's arms go from a strong symmetrical situation like so to one where your opponent's endangered arm is put in something rather like an American lock, okay, and they feel like they're just the small weak rotator cuff muscles are holding them in place, and it's easy now to separate arms and break them. So if Placido is lying down, here you can see my elbow is inside his elbow. This is an excellent grip to hold people in place. Whether I put my thumb on my own collarbone, that's one good method, or my hand on my own thigh, that's another good method. This locks me in this elbow to elbow situation. If Placido goes to pull his arm away from me, it feels impossible. It's wedged in place. Okay, great way to control people, but it's a lousy way to separate arms. Okay, if I just try to pull, make a strong arm, Placido. If I just try to pull in this direction, there's no way that pulling elbow to elbow will separate his arms. Okay, instead, we have to get used to the idea of coming up elbow to wrist. From the elbow to wrist, I take Placido's forearm and I put it across my chest, hence the name cross chest position. From the cross chest position, as I said, it's rather like putting your opponent in an American lock. There's a whole bunch of ways we can do this, and this general position is the one I like to do separation from. From here, any application of body weight makes it very difficult for my opponent to prevent the hands slipping apart, and then we go into our breaking sequences. Okay, you have to trust that there is a world of difference between your opponent's arms being symmetrical and strong, and a pull on the elbow does no good at all, versus his arm being put into this weak American lock type position, from where even relatively small pulling forces will separate my training partner's arms. Let's demonstrate this in a way which is quite useful for you as a student. If I take a belt and I go through Placido's arms, okay, make a strong arm, Placido. If I pull, Placido's whole body will move and his hands will not come unlocked. Okay, his whole body can be pulled easily across the mat. However, if I take that same situation and I adjust the belt position up here to the wrist, now when I go to pull, you'll see that the hands come undone long before the body moves. There is a world of difference between elbow to elbow pulling, in which Placido's body is so strong that his whole body will move along the mat rather than his hands come undone, versus elbow to wrist, where even moderate pulling forces will simply pull the hands apart. Once you understand this simple mechanical insight, you will start to develop a mental habit in the Jujutami position of never settling for this kind of business. You see people doing this all day, pulling, the arm's never going to come undone that way. Always, we come up to the wrist, okay? Once we bring the elbow to the wrist and we achieve the cross chest position, that's where suddenly strong men start to feel weak. There's a whole bunch of ways we can do this, okay? In hand-to-hand positions, typically I just go here, it's fairly simple, but we can apply stronger methods where we actually apply a true American lock to our training partner's arm and separate. If my opponent has locked his hands elbow to elbow, like so, then from here we can still find shoulder to wrist. The only time it's very difficult to get the cross chest position is when my opponent figure fours. Okay, in the figure four scenario, it can be more difficult to get the classic cross chest position. In these kinds of scenarios, typically we use legs to separate our training partner's arms and then ultimately come back to get the break. But in any situation other than a figure of four, cross chest is the way to go. You can see its mechanical efficiency with this simple demonstration with the belt. Now, it's time for us to start looking at the 5 progressions for hand position as we go through a control of our opponent, and when they're lying on the back, we've got the Jujigatami in place, and it's time to extend their arm and go all the way through to a break. Let's have a look at this right now. Okay, we've successfully put an opponent down. We've got the overall Juji position. Our first hand position or arm position here is always elbow to elbow. When we go to control an opponent, the best thing for me to do is to go through one-handed, another hand on the floor behind me so that my head stays over his head. And in this position, I'm elbow to elbow. This locks his arm in such a way that if he tried to slip his elbow out of here, it would be a very difficult thing. Okay, this gives excellent control of your opponent. The basic purpose of this first elbow to elbow position is simply control. Okay, often when you get into a Jujigatami position, there's a wild struggle. When you first, he's obviously trying to get his arm out of here. He's trying to slip his elbow, and there's a lot of activity. So we like to just get initial control of our opponent by getting our legs asymmetrical, locking in, and making sure we shuffle in close to his shoulders, and we stay elbow to elbow. So when he goes to yank away from me, that forms an excellent control of your opponent's elbow joint. Okay, so my legs lock to his shoulders and my elbow locks me to his elbow. So when we go to move around here, you feel you've got excellent control of the man. Okay, now as good as that elbow to elbow grip is for initial control, it is not good for the next phase of the attack. At some point, we got to start coming up and separating his arms. Okay, and you're not going to do that by pulling elbow to elbow. At this point, we need to go in and get elbow to wrist. My elbow needs to start coming up to his wrist, and this is going to create what we call the cross chest position, where his forearm goes across my chest. If I can put my opponent into the cross chest position, you have an excellent chance now of separating his arms. Why? Because this is essentially like being put in an American lock, and the arm is simply not strong in these positions. Okay, I'm working now against his weak rotator cuff muscles in the back of the shoulder, and this is much easier than working against the solid mass of pectoral, shoulder girdle, and upper back when you're pulling elbow to elbow. This is just to hold people, but when it's time to separate arms, we come up elbow to wrist and we create the cross chest situation. Okay, once we get them cross chest, now it's going to be so much easier to go in and separate my training partner's arms, but that's where the problem starts. Just as we go to separate the arms, there's no control over his hand. And so my opponent can just go thumb down and turn out. And so many times you see this happen. You did everything great, you controlled the guy, you separate his hands, and then when it's finally time to extend his arm, he just spins on out and escapes. It's so frustrating. Okay? That's why we bring in the critical third hand placement. Okay? We start off elbow to elbow. We switch elbow to wrist. Then when we go elbow to wrist, we go hand to elbow and we lock in, so that from the cross chest position, when I go to separate his arms, I glue his right elbow to my right hip. Now when Placido goes to turn out, he can't complete the turnout because his elbow is on the incorrect hip. To hit a turnout, Placido has to put his elbow on this hip. So my hand grip prevents him from doing so. Okay. Now when he goes to turn out, it's physically impossible. Now we put on a half hand grip, and 2 hands come down like so. And now we create a high elbow, a push hand, and a pull hand. And as a result, we can create tremendous braking pressure on our training partner's elbow. If for any particular reason this proved insufficient, we would go into the 5th and final movement, which involves me taking my push hand and going around behind my opponent, locking my own leg, locking my own hip, and falling back with the underarm grip, which provides the strongest of all the various braking pressures for Jujigatami. So once again, 5 progressions of hand position that take us all the way from the initial Juji control all the way through to the strongest breaks in the sport. We start off elbow to elbow, just like so. When he goes to pull away, it's so difficult. You've got tremendous control of your opponent. Let's make sure that our thumb touches our collarbone. Okay, so you are holding an invisible gi here. Okay, the further my thumb from my collarbone, the more elbow slippage becomes a problem. Okay, so we always want thumb to collarbone. From this position, we need to go to the next progression. Okay, we've got control. Now it's time to go into separation. So we go elbow to wrist, and we go take our opponent to the cross chest position. As we do this, our right hand controls his right elbow, so that as we separate, he goes to turn out and finds it physically impossible. Now we go into the 2-on-1 wrist. We lock up, we create a push hand and a pull hand. We create a good high fulcrum to work with. When Placido goes to turn out now, it's almost impossible. And we can create tremendous pressure on the arm. If for whatever reason this proved insufficient, then we would push, come up and put the hand behind our back. My hand grabs my own hip, my leg is grabbed by my left hand, and we pull everything in very, very tight here. And this creates the strongest breaking position of them all. A lot of times that first step is just unnecessary because conventional judo positions are pretty damn effective. But every so often you'll run into someone who's very, very flexible and you'll need to use that. So once again, the 5 progressions of the hands and arms. The first step in these progressions is always elbow to elbow. From here, it offers maximal control of the elbow joint, while my legs offer maximal control of the head and shoulders. I switch and I come in elbow to wrist. That's going to create what we call the cross chest position, where his forearm goes across my chest in a position where he's mechanically at a strong disadvantage. Now only the weak rotator cuff muscles are holding his 2 hands together. But when it's time to straighten an arm, we want to make sure we go in and we control that elbow. His right arm to my right hip, just like so. His right elbow to my right hip. When he goes to turn out, he won't be able to complete the turn out. And this will create a vulnerable wrist that we can grab with a half hand grip and lock up. And from here, we've got the perfect breaking position. If for whatever reason this proved insufficient for a flexible opponent, then we would set up, put everything behind our back, grab our own hip, grab our own shin, and then find ourselves in the strongest breaking position of them all. When Placido goes to turn out of this lock, it's well nigh impossible. And we get very, very strong breaks indeed from here. This simple 5-step progression of hand and arm position will be your guide as to how to control the toughest opponents, all the way from the initial control phase into the strongest breaks in the sport. A very useful way for you to enhance your understanding of Judo Gatame and have a clear sense of what you're trying to do as you battle for the position is to break Judo Gatame down into 4 distinct phases that go in a sequence. They're not just random, it's all done in a sequence. And once you understand this, it'll give you a very clear sense of order as what you're trying to do as you plug your way through on your opponent. Let's start off with someone down and lying on your back. And we're going into Judo Gatame on our opponent. The first phase is the entry phase. And the single biggest requirement on our part is to get our opponent's elbow inside our hip. As long as his elbows are outside of our hips, you're never going to be able to make a turn or a pivot into a successful Judo Gatame. So our whole thing is to first get his elbow inside our hip. The closer his elbow comes to my center line, the easier that becomes. But at a minimum, his elbow has to be inside my hip. Okay? Once it's there, it's got to stay there. Now, getting an elbow inside the hip from it's not an easy thing, and a large part of what we look at in this video will be dealing with exactly that issue. How do you get an elbow inside the hip? But for now, let's just say we've succeeded in doing so. Say a Jiu-Jitsu 101 method like this. The next big thing is control, okay? Specifically, control of the shoulder girdle, particularly on the side that you want to arm lock. So if I want to arm lock my opponent's left arm, it is absolutely critical that my knee come up over his shoulder and exert some form of control. At the same time, my second leg wants to go through and turn in this direction so that my knee physically covers my training partner's shoulder. So now we have his elbow well inside our hip, positioned close to our center line, and his shoulder is completely controlled by the action of my 2 legs. So we've got the first prerequisite, we've entered in successfully, putting the elbow inside the hip, and now we've got complete control of the shoulder girdle. So now the control aspect, the second phase, control, is satisfied. Once we get into this notion of the control phase, the third stage is separation. If your opponent has any idea what he's doing in the sport of jiu-jitsu, once you get to a Judogatame situation, he's going to lock his arms defensively. If he's in complete neophyte and doesn't understand what's going on, you would just go directly for the break here. But you guys, of course, are not dealing with neophytes. You're dealing with fellow jiu-jitsu students who know damn well what an arm lock is, and they're all going to start locking up their arms defensively. So then we go into the third stage, the separation phase, where from here we're looking to use various methods of separation to lock up our training partner's arms and get through to enter into the fourth and final phase of the Judogatame sequence, which is the breaking phase. And we'll be spending a lot of time on that. We now have our opponent's arm locked out, and we're in a position now we can do damage to the elbow. So there are 4 distinct phases that we work with. First, the entry phase, which is mostly bound up with the idea of getting the elbow inside the hip. Then the control phase, which is mostly bound up with the idea of getting control of the shoulder girdle, particularly on the same side as the armbar is about to occur. Once we get the cross-face leg over, then we go into the third phase, which is to do with separating our opponent's arms, okay? And we'll be looking at a whole host of manners in which we can get separation of those arms to occur. Then there's the fourth and final phase, which involves breaking the arm. This is the pure active lever and fulcrum here. And this is where things get fun for you and horrible for the other person. Those 4 phases are the sequential steps behind almost every control-based approach to Judogatame. Interestingly, speed-based methods skip 2 of those stages. They just go directly from the entry to the breaking mechanics because they're so fast. But the more high percentage controlled methods of entry, control-based methods, involve at least those 4 distinct stages, and the primary emphasis of this video will be on those 4-step methods. Now it's time to go into one of the most important sections of this entire Judogatame armbar instructional. This is the idea of multiplicity. It's my contention that if you want to maximize your effectiveness with Judogatame, you must understand that there are more than one form of Judogatame. Each one has its good points and its bad points. You must understand what these good points and bad points are so that you can adapt them for the various situations you find yourself in. It is critical that you be able to go from one to another in live situations so that as a new challenge emerges, as you're trying to control a position, you can adapt to a new form of Judogatame to overcome those new challenges. If you just stick with one form of Judogatame and try to use a one-size-fits-all, it's hard to get it to work against resistance. You should be able to switch effortlessly from one type of Judogatame to another in response to your opponent's movements. It's important then that we outline for you what are the main forms of Judogatame, understand all of them, their good points, their bad points, so that we can use them in combination to overcome strong resistance. Let's look first at what is arguably the least desirable and the least strong of the various Judogatames. Okay? I often refer to this one as a quarter Judogatame. This is where I have a foot here underneath my opponent's near shoulder and a single cross-face leg, so that my control over my opponent's shoulder is never going to be as tight as one where I have both legs across my opponent's torso. Here I only have one leg across and one leg remains on the same side as me. Okay? You can see what the problem is. There's no control underneath my opponent's far arm, so that as I go to separate my training partner's hands, it's relatively easy for my opponent to turn out and go into various forms of escape. Even if my opponent did just accept this position, when I go to apply braking pressure, it's hard for me to get true braking pressure if my opponent moved my cross-face leg There's literally nothing now holding him down, and he can easily get out. Secondly, even if he didn't perform that, he just toughed it out and just accepted this as a braking position, it's hard for me to get true braking pressure in this position. Okay? As a general rule, when we find ourselves in the quarter Judigatami position, what we are typically looking to do is to take this leg out of its mechanically rather disadvantageous position and bring it across to another form of Judigatami. This is a good transitory position. Okay, it's a good position you can go into for brief periods of time, and then we're typically looking to move into other forms of Judigatami that are stronger for the finish. There is one exception to this rule though. There is one version of the quarter Judigatami which I do like and which is a strong position. This is where I have a quarter Juji plus an overwrap grip. The overwrap grip will overcome many of the problems associated with a normal quarter Juji. And as my opponent goes to turn out, move out, etc., this is a very strong grip to control people, and it's got good braking pressure for the finish. Okay, so the one exception to the rule, if I'm going to use a quarter Judigatami, it's usually in this situation here, where I lock on and I use an overwrap grip to overcome the problems of a conventional quarter Judigatami, which is not particularly strong. Okay, so that's our first Judigatami. Now, let's look at a situation where I bring my foot across, just like so, and we look at the half Judigatami. Half Judigatami is where I have, again, one leg across my opponent's body, and I have a foot here with no cross-face leg. My leg is underneath here. So I have good control of the torso through my right leg, but I have no cross-face, so I have poor control of the head. This position offers some advantages, also a lot of weaknesses. The obvious weakness is that there's no direct control of your opponent's head. The good news is, however, that you've got excellent control of your opponent's armpit reaching through the right foot. Okay? When I go to separate my training partner's arms in this position, when he goes to turn into me, it's relatively easy because of the lack of the cross-face leg. Okay? That's why I typically don't favor this as a finishing position. However, it is a good position for transitioning into other forms of Judigatami that are good for finishing people. So again, like the quarter Judigatami, this one is used mostly as a transitional position. Okay, so quarter and half Juji are not really strong finishing positions, but they are useful for you to know as transitional positions to get to stronger variations of the move. So say for example, my opponent took my crossface leg and pushed it off, then I might quickly transition into a half Juji and turn my knee down. And as a result, I could make a switch into, say for example, a triangle. So you can see that in that transitional phase, the half Juji was useful. Did I hold it for long? Nope, it's not that strong. But it is a useful position for you to know and understand and see what its value is. Its value is as a way of transitioning into other forms of lock, whether it be a triangle or another form of armbar. So we've got quarter Judigatami and half Judigatami. Now let's look at one of my absolute favorites, and this one I do use a lot for finishing positions. This is the 3/4 Judigatami. In a 3/4 Juji, I take my foot inside my training partner's bicep and I put it down here as a lock on my training partner's neck. My second foot goes over the top and both feet draw in. This gives me tremendous and very direct control of my opponent's head. Essentially what it does is it gives me two cross-face legs. Yes, it's true. You lose control of the armpit. That's the cost. But you gain tremendous control of the head. In addition, when your opponent goes to employ a turning escape and go out in this direction, he finds to his horror that this repositioned right leg makes it very difficult for him to turn and get up successfully. He can turn a certain distance and then no further, and you can always return him back down to the mat. This also creates a very high fulcrum, so that when we lock up in this position, it's easy for me to get my hips up off the floor and create strong braking pressure. It also means if my opponent turns into me, it's very easy for me in these situations to make transitions into Sankaku, the triangle, and finish with a stranglehold. So this is a very, very advantageous form of lock. It makes turnout escapes significantly more difficult. It creates the opportunity for strangulations through triangles, and it creates a very high fulcrum to get strong braking mechanics. In addition, it's also a very good lock to switch off into the overwrap grips. When my opponent goes to pull out from here, it's enormously difficult, and this creates a punishing lock. So that's the 3/4 juji, and that is absolutely one of the of my personal favorite ways to work with juji gatame. Now let's look at the full juji gatame. Full juji is the one that most people associate with the juji gatame position. That's where I have 2 legs across. I have a cross-face leg and a torso leg, and we lock in like so. Okay, with both legs across, you've got 2 legs controlling your opponent's head and shoulders and upper body. It's a very, very strong, powerful position to attack your opponents in. As we saw earlier in the video, when it's time to control people, I generally prefer an asymmetrical position here. When we're symmetrical, 2 legs, both symmetrical with each other, it's pretty easy for opponents to turn into us and generate escapes. But when we go asymmetrical and lock up, now you can start to pommel our legs from position to position. When I'm symmetrical like so, when I try to pommel my legs, so much space develops, it's easy for my opponent to start slipping his elbows inside. But when we have asymmetrical legs, it's very easy for me to pommel legs into various other forms of attacking position and not lose the various positions that we want. Okay, so when we work in the full juji position, generally I favor, for the purposes of control, asymmetrical legs. But when it's time to actually physically break someone, then I favor that high hip position, legs up off the floor, and from here we get the strong breaks that we're looking for. Understand that there are 2 forms of full juji gatame. There are open forms where my feet are apart. These are the ones we use most of the time. Okay, here my feet are not touching each other, so this is an open full juji gatame. That changes when we start crossing our feet. Okay, now we've got a closed juji gatame. When my opponent goes to spin away from me, it's difficult because of the closure of my legs. Okay, when my opponent tries to bring his elbow inside my hip, difficult because of the closure of my legs. And this represents a different way of holding the juji. You lose a little bit in cross-face pressure, but you gain something in control of the far shoulder. You can pull in a little bit better, okay? If you have necessary length of legs, you can even go further than this and start to lock the figure of 4 over your training partner's far leg. And then from here, you get excellent control of your opponent with a variation of a closed juji. Now, let's start going into another form of juji gatame, which I also favor a lot. This is, again, a personal favorite of mine. This is the head scissor juji gatame. We have our opponent with his hands locked. From here, I'm going to take my torso leg and pommel it through, and I'm going to take my shoelaces and put them underneath my training partner's head and neck, and then my 2 legs scissor around his head. So we have this scissoring effect around the head and shoulders. If we turn in this direction, well, you can see that my shoelaces are under the neck, and the second leg comes over. Your training partner should feel a mild strangulation. This is not a full strangle. He's not going to pass out, but he will feel a mild strangulation here. The great advantage of this is it creates a much higher breaking fulcrum. Okay, let's do a simple experiment. Here's a full juji gatame. You can see that Placido's hand easily touches my chest, and he's not even close to breaking pressure. Okay, so from here, it's going to be hard to hit an effective break on someone as flexible as this. However, Loctite, if I take my foot and thread through into the head scissor juji gatame, you will see now breaking pressure is here, and he's still a hand width or more away from my chest. Okay, this is the breaking point, and yet I still have a long way to take his arm into a break, because my breaking fulcrum, because of my foot position, is now significantly higher than it would be for a conventional juji gatame. In addition, when my opponent goes to spin out, my right foot underneath his head functions rather like a half Nelson, and it prevents my opponent from turning out in this direction. The only real weakness of this grip is that my opponent can use my isolated left leg to push the cross-face leg off and create problems for me turning up into me. Okay, but as far as weaknesses go, that's not a bad one. There's much worse out there than that. So once again, my opponent locks his hands in tight. We've seen this idea that we pommel our foot to the inside position. Now, I can't be naive here, guys. I can't just kind of open up my legs and try to put my foot, and he's going to explode up on me here and cause all kinds of problems. We've got to do this in a way which isn't naive. Look how I just tilt, and from here, I pommel my legs into place so that I quickly catch him. Now, from this position, when he goes to turn out, impossible. When he tries to protect his arms and turn and move, etc., it's so difficult, and we get a truly shocking degree of breaking pressure on our training partner's arms. Now, let's look at the last form of Jujigatame. This is a special variation, which you will see it being used occasionally by people. The best I ever saw at this is Gordon Ryan. He does this spectacularly well. I've seen a few other people try it with mixed results, but done well, this can be an incredibly useful addition to your Jujigatame arsenal. This is the shoulder sankaku. Okay, the idea is, we know now from earlier in this video, always the target of control in Jujigatame is your opponent's shoulder, the whole shoulder girdle. Indirectly, there's control of the head, since the head and shoulders are closely related to each other. In a shoulder sankaku, I literally just lock a triangle around my opponent's shoulder, and it creates enormously strong arm breaking positions. You sacrifice control of the head, but it's not much of a sacrifice, because in truth, the head and shoulder are so close to each other, and my knee position is often so closely tied to my opponent's head, you get different ways of controlling the head. Let's have a look at some varieties of shoulder sankaku. From a situation where I start off in a fairly conventional Jujigatame, one variation might be where I come through and I lock a triangle over my opponent's shoulder and put my knee in as a crossface. Now, as Placido goes to turn out, he runs into my knee and can't turn out. When he tries to turn into me, he runs into the hip and my right knee. And from here, the breaking fulcrum is incredibly strong. Okay, just because of the change in angle. My fulcrum is no longer high, but I'm not pulling down anymore. I'm pulling across. And as a result, you have almost unlimited breaking ability. Okay, that's one form of shoulder sankaku. Another is to lock my triangle and put my foot across the hip. Okay, now this is crazy. We've got one foot that goes across the torso, like a torso leg. We've got one leg here, which is not really functioning as a conventional crossface, but it does have crossface properties because my knee is pointed into his head. When he tries to turn into me, again, incredibly difficult, and the breaking pressure here is immense. The reason why these shoulder sankakus are so dangerous in terms of breaking power is because they do such a good job of taking your opponent's elbow directly onto your hip bone. Okay, they come at a price. Everything comes at a price. The price is you don't have direct control of your opponent's head. In addition, your opponent's other arm is free to start posting on your knees and slipping the elbow out. That can happen. Okay, so for example, if I hit a shoulder sankaku in this direction and he started pushing on my knee and slipping his elbow, there's a danger he could turn in and start to free his knee. Okay, it's not that much of a danger because I do have the advantage here. My knees are very close together and we've got a full triangle locked around, so when he tries to move my legs, it's not going to be easy. It's not an easy thing to do, and he doesn't have much time. The pros, the good points of shoulder sankakus is the directness with which you put your opponent's elbow right over the hard bones of the hip, which provides an incredible breaking fulcrum. In addition, because you're no longer pulling down on the hand, but rather pushing it from left to right, you have an almost unlimited capacity to use your hips as a fulcrum to break the arm over. Okay, so from a full juji position where I feel my opponent's moving around and we're having a hard time controlling him for the break, this would be a great time for us to thread our legs into these other alternative positions. And from here, when Placido goes to move around on me and twist and turn, you find you just have these incredibly strong shoulder sankaku locks in the various ways that we saw. Now, thank you. We've just looked at a host of different methods of Jujigatame. Okay, we went through quarter, we went through half, we went through 3/4, we went through full open, full closed. We saw the idea of a head scissor, and now we've seen the idea of a shoulder sankaku. Okay, that's 7 varieties of Jujigatame. Now what I want to do is to start giving you a sense in which how we can go from one to the other. It doesn't matter that you know all 7. What matters is that you can use all 7 in combination. That's what I want you to have. Knowledge of all 7 is one thing. Being able to use all 7 the same way a boxer uses punches and combinations, that's a dangerous, dangerous thing. That'll be a weapon that you'll be able to use for the rest of your jiu-jitsu career. Certain things have to be done for you to use these moves in combination. First, you've got to have the ability to pommel with your legs at will. Okay? The only way you can do that is if your legs don't carry weight. If your legs are bolted to the floor, like so, you're not going to pommel your legs on anyone. So what we need to have is an ability to brace ourselves on one elbow so that my legs become weightless. And as a result, we can pommel our legs into the various configurations that we saw. So if we have an opponent who's down, first things first, if all my weight's forward on my feet, it's hard for me to pommel. Okay. Secondly, if my opponent's in a figure of 4, I have to be able to pommel into fairly narrow spaces. Okay, so I should be able to contour my feet and ankles in order to accommodate that. So what I do here is I bring my elbow down to the floor and I put my knee inside his bicep. Okay. If my knee is outside his bicep, he can bring his elbows down to his chest and there's no space for me to get my feet inside. Okay? So the first thing I do is I bring my knee inside the bicep. Now from here, I bring my foot to my own knee, and as a result, I can easily pommel around the quarter, and lo and behold, we're now in a 3/4 Jujigatami. So I went from a full Juji, that's our starting point, into a 3/4. From the 3/4, I pick my foot up, and from here, I go into the head scissor. From the head scissor, I go through into one variation of shoulder senkaku. From the shoulder senkaku, I can bring my foot back in and extract. From this simple extraction, we can go back into a 3/4. From here, it's not a difficult thing for us to start pulling my legs out and go into a half. From the half, I go back to full and then back into quarter Jujigatami. Okay, and you can see it's an easy thing for me to begin this pommeling process because I'm placed on my hand and elbow. If I had 2 hands on my opponent, you feel very uncoordinated when you try to pommel. So we want space and the ability to lean my head in various directions so that we can easily pommel our legs into the various scenarios that we want to be effective in these situations. And in this way, we can go from one Jujigatami into another at will. Once you gain this ability to move from one to another, that's when you'll become a dangerous, dangerous man with the Jujigatami lock, and to be able to go from one to another in these easy combinations that mean you'll be able to go through your opponent's resistance whenever you wish. Now, we're going to go into a very different part of the video now. This is the part of the video concerned with entering into Jujigatami. So far, all of our attention has been focused on what to do once we get there, how to control people, how to move around people, how to break people, etc., etc. Now it's time to actually look at situations in which you find yourself every day in the sport of jiu-jitsu, guys wrestling in front of you, and you want to enter into the juji and put them under pressure. Let's understand that there are different scenarios in which this takes place. My approach to Jujigatami and the system which I espouse is split in 2 very different directions. There are situations where we are chest to chest with someone. So my chest faces his chest, and from here I can enter into Jujigatami. I can do so from seated situations, or I can do so from supine situations where my back is flat on the ground. Okay, but one thing doesn't change. My chest faces his chest. So this is one half of the Juji system that I teach. Chest to chest situations, which are divided into supine, my back on the floor, and seated, my back off the floor. Okay. There is also a situation where we're chest to back. My opponent's in turtle position. if I'm chest to back on my training partner, this is also a situation where I can employ Jujigatami, okay? And my approach to Juji is split between those two, chest to back system and chest to chest system. We're going to start with the chest to chest system, and in particular, we're going to start with the supine situation, since I believe this is how most people begin their study of Jujigatami from bottom position. Okay, let's start off with a training partner right here, and we'll start from the closed guard scenario, since I believe that's where most of you probably began your study of Jujigatami from bottom position. Whenever we have someone here in a closed guard, let's understand something right from the start. The only way I'm going to be able to enter into my opponent is if I form an angle upon them. Juji literally means cross. I have to form a cross relative to my opponent to enter into the Jujigatami. If I am lined up with my opponent, it's very, very difficult to go into a Jujigatami arm lock. I have to form some degree of angle, sometimes more, sometimes less, but I can't do it square onto my opponent. In addition, if my opponent's elbows are outside my hips, that prevents my hips from moving side to side and prevents me from getting an angle. And as a result, it's very hard for me to get into the Juji position. So the first thing I always want to do whenever I enter into Jujigatami from closed guard is to take my opponent's elbow towards my center line. Only when his elbow goes towards my center line does it become easy for me to start to form advantageous angles where I look across my opponent and go into the Juji position. Okay? As long as his elbows are clamped around my hips, clamp hard, I cannot form effective angles on my opponent now. Okay? So our whole thing in these situations is step number one, bring his elbow towards his center line. There's different ways I can do this. The classic method involves me taking my right arm over my opponent's right elbow, like so. And from here, holding onto the wrist, putting a foot on my training partner's hip, and pulling the elbow to the center line. It's a good method. Okay? So let's have a look at it in detail. My opponent's going to start with hands on my biceps, just like so. From here, I'm going to pommel my hand to the inside position. And from here, I'm going to bring his wrist onto my chest and get a hold of his elbow. Now from here, we clam up on our training partner, make a strong body. And from here, we put our foot on our training partner's hip and we pull the elbow to the center line. As a result, we're in a good situation now to put our second hand across. My foot comes up high on my training partner and I look directly into my training partner's ear. And as a result, from this position, it's relatively simple for me to throw my leg over the top and go into a classic Jujigatami from bottom position. So if you were to look at Jiu-Jitsu 101, an introductory text on how to get into Jujigatami, you'd probably see something like this. Once again, he's got hands on my biceps. From here, we pommel our hand to the inside position. I go across and I cross grip the elbow. I draw the elbow to the center line. And from this position, we control the wrist long enough that I can put my foot on my training partner's hip and bring myself to an angle where one foot goes up high across the line of the shoulders. My other knee blocks his shoulder in place. I place my hand in, my leg goes over the top, and from here we have a strong Jujigatami for the finish. Okay? So this would be kind of like a Jiu-Jitsu 101 method of applying the Jujigatami from bottom closed guard. It's a fine method, it works just fine, especially at introductory levels. However, it illustrates some of what we need to be able to do with Jujigatami, and it also starts to point towards some shortcomings of this traditional method, which make it a little more difficult to apply as we go higher and higher up the skill level of opponents. First off, the interesting thing about it is that it teaches us the first step of any entrance into Jujigatami from bottom position, which is the idea of elbow to center line. You will hear me coaching this to my athletes on many, many occasions, and I hope to coach it to you in this video. Step number one, get the elbow to the center line. The classical method involves going over the forearm. It's a good method, okay, but it does have a drawback. Okay, from hands on biceps, I know that I have to bring his elbow to my center line. okay? But by putting two hands here on the wrist and the elbow, nothing is controlling his head. So it does a fine job of the first step of Jujigatame entrance, which is bringing the elbow to the center line. But the next big problem is this. Once I get this grip, it's no secret what's coming next. He knows I'm interested in an armbar, and as a result, when I go to try to put my foot on the hip, his head starts to rise. Okay? Now, earlier in this video, we saw that the key to any Jujigatame is my ability to control the shoulder. I want to break the elbow, but I want to control the shoulder. And what happens is when his head starts to rise, his shoulder gets further and further away from my hips. And the control of his shoulder is all about hip to shoulder contact. As he moves further and further away, you end up in these horrible situations where you've got a disastrous looking armbar here, no control of the shoulder whatsoever, my hip a mile away from his elbow, and he just yanks his arm and it's all gone. It's a disaster. Okay. So what do we need here? Well, step number one never changes. Okay, we always want to create a situation where his elbow goes to the center line. But we've got to do something better with regard to step number two. We've got to do a better job of controlling his posture. It's very hard, without the benefit of a gi and a lapel grip, to just control the posture just with his arm. Okay, his head rises. It's so hard for me to control him here. A much better way for us to work is to directly control his posture through his head. And that's why I generally advocate a different approach to gripping. So when my opponent goes in, instead of using the classical methods of overwrapping my opponent's elbow, I like to use a simple method where I control my opponent's elbow from underneath. So there's his elbow. I lock in just like so. You may remember this grip that we looked at briefly in standing position on other videos. Let's say an opponent was standing in front of me and he was interested in reaching for my leg. Like so. Okay? It's easy for him because there's nothing impeding the use of his arms. But if we tie up and I hold underneath my training partner's arms, like so, when he goes to reach for my legs, it's physically impossible because I'm underneath his arms. Okay, so you will often see people engage in upper body tie-ups when they don't want their opponent getting to their legs. You will often see them tying up just exactly like this. Now when he goes to reach for my legs, it's such a difficult thing. And as a result, we can keep him away from the legs because he physically can't bring his hands down. If my hands left this position, there's no reason why he couldn't grab a leg. So you'll often see people monitoring their opponent's arms in these situations just like so. Okay, we can do exactly the same thing from closed guard. I know what he wants to do. He wants to pull his elbow back towards my hip. Okay, so once I take an elbow across to the center line here, I hold it in exactly that fashion. When he goes to pull his elbow back, the only way he can do it is if his head rises and he goes over my hand. Now he can slip away. However, when I have this grip, I pull him with my legs and I physically hold my training partner's head. My intention is to bring his head and his elbow as close together as possible. When he goes to posture up and away, it's a difficult thing, and you've got great control of him. Now, I shift my hips out, and I do the one thing which will enable me to control his shoulder. I lock the so-called top lock, my guard locked over the top of his shoulders. I can use my locked feet to pull my hips upwards into his armpit. If there's one rule that you must understand when it comes time to lock your opponents from bottom position, it's this. Your success or failure is bound up almost entirely with your ability to bring your hips to your opponent's armpit and shoulder. The further the distance between your hips and his shoulder and armpit, the less successful you're going to be. So our whole thing here is first, we get the elbow to the center line. Then I keep it in place by controlling the posture. He goes to pull away, and it's difficult. I shimmy out, and I throw my legs over the top and lock. My hips are driving up to him. When he goes to pull his arm free, it's so difficult. Everything's just locked in place. The only thing he can do now is to lock the figure of four defensively. If he was an idiot and just stayed in this position, we'd just finish him right here. There's no need to even put the leg over the head. This is a great finishing position. Okay, so he's got to lock up his arms defensively. I put my hand inside. My left goes against his right. Okay, from this position, I have a free hand. I take my hand inside my training partner's leg and I start an action of turning so that my knee points inwards towards his shoulder. My right foot goes directly over his head. My left knee points into the shoulder, and I bring my left knee and right foot as close together as possible. When he goes to yank his arm out, it's shockingly difficult. From here, I bring my leg across in front, and from here, it's an easy thing to guide him down to the mat. Once we get him down to the mat, all those things that we saw earlier start to kick in. We can put our elbow on the floor. We can draw the leg across. We can come up on top of our training partner. We can roll the man through. We can pommel to other forms of Jujigatami, etc., etc. What we're trying to do is to break down a step-by-step approach to Jujigatami from closed guard. You can clearly see what these steps entail. Step number 1 is always to bring your opponent's elbow towards your center line. That frees up your hips and lets you form advantageous angles. Step number 2 is to control the one thing which will enable your opponent to recover his elbow position, and that's his posture. So I favor gripping the head. Step number 3 is to form a solid connection of your hips to your opponent's shoulder girdle. And the number one way of doing this in modern day competition is the use of the top lock, where I take my guard and relock it on the top of my training partner's shoulders and pull my hips up. Step number 4 is to utilize our arm as a scooping grip, which enables me to turn to an even more radical angle and start to make use of my knee turning into my opponent's shoulder as a wedge. I'm going to come back to that point in the next section because it's extremely important and never get stressed. Okay, it's a critical point of your success. Don't worry, I'll come back to it. And then finally, we want to put him on his back. We saw earlier today that in general, it's easier to finish Jujigatami armbars when you're on top of people than when you're underneath. Now, you can finish it from underneath, nothing wrong with that. But whenever you can, put him down on his back. It makes things easier, okay? Now, let's have a look at those in detail again. My opponent starts off in a closed guard situation. First things first, if his elbows are wide down here, I'll never get an angle on him, okay? So that's going to stop me in my tracks. So our whole first thing is to go through and bring the elbow towards the center line. Then from here, I use a grip, which makes it very difficult for him to pull his elbow back to a position of safety. Then I control his posture. When he goes to pull away from me, it won't be easy. I turn out, and from here I lock the top lock. He has to form his arms into a defensive figure of 4. If he's a fool, and he doesn't, there's no reason why I can't apply a lock directly from here, okay? Without even putting my leg over the top. So he has to do it. It's not his choice. From here, my left hand threads inside his right, and I scoop inside my training partner's leg. From here, I take that critical turn of my shoulder and my hips so that my hips face initially towards his hips and ultimately my hips face towards the front. It's only this turning off the shoulder action which creates a strong set of wedges around my opponent's head and shoulders. When he goes to yank out, it's not going to be easy from here. And as a result, I can quickly get my legs in place. Our general preference is to put him down on his back, from where the control and the finishes are stronger and from where there are many more options, the many different varieties of Jujigatami which we can use for our various finishes. That's our first look at Jujigatami from closed guard. I'm going to come back and show many variations and many other key themes in more detail. This is a move you're going to be using all the way through your jiu-jitsu career. Typically, we learn it as white belts, and you'll still be using it no matter how advanced you become as a black belt. It's one of the absolute foundational moves of the sport. The more time you invest in it, the more success you're going to have. This is a move, as I said, that will never go out of fashion. It will always be there, figuring highly in the most successful the most esteemed submission holds in the sport. Invest time in it. Invest time in understanding, and you'll soon reap the rewards on the mat. Now, I want to spend some extra time on the idea of a shoulder pivot. A shoulder pivot is one of the absolute most important details of any judogatame, from bottom position and closed guard in particular. If you can pivot off your opponent's shoulder and change the angle of your hips relative to your opponent, you're going to finish a lot of people. If you can't, it's going to be a struggle. Okay, so let's have a look at what a shoulder pivot is, why it's so important, and how we can get better at it. Okay, from a situation, let's come on this one. We're in like so. We know that step number one is always to bring the elbow towards the center line. Okay. Step number two is to control my training partner's posture. When he goes to yank out, our whole thing is to turn a slight angle, and then from here to throw our legs over the shoulder and lock a top lock. From here we lock up our opponent's shoulder with the top lock. The central idea behind the top lock is shoulder control. When my opponent goes to yank his elbow out, it's difficult because the shoulder itself is controlled. Okay. Now from here I go through and lock. Currently I am facing into my opponent. That is not wrong, it's not terrible, but it's not desirable. The most desirable thing is for me to use my scooping hand to scoop inside his leg and turn so that my hips go from facing him to facing forwards. Okay. Now, watch my left leg. A very important thing occurs when I make that pivot. My left leg, and in particular, my left knee, turn inwards and windshield wiper so that my knee faces into my opponent's shoulder. If my knee faces outwards and my opponent pulls his elbow, it's so easy for him to escape. But when my knee faces inwards, like so, it forms a perfect wedge. And when he goes to yank his arm free, it's very, very difficult. I reinforce that wedge with my right foot pulling down like a back heel. So when he goes to yank out, it's so difficult. And then from here, we go in over the top and put the man down to the floor. It is absolutely critical that you master this simple motion of turning off your opponent's shoulder. Now, it's tempting when you do this just to rely on your arm, to pull yourself around. You can't do that. You've got to understand the movement comes from the turning of your hips. The arm is more of holding you in place while the hips do the moving. So we start off just like so. I catch and throw my legs up. And from this situation, look, I pass the hands through. Now, initially, there's that turn. And as a result, when I clamp down with my right foot and pull in with my left knee, when he goes to yank out, it feels so difficult. And we get good transitions into the lock. Now I'm going to show you from a different angle so you can know exactly when you've done this correctly and when you haven't. Ironically, you won't know from looking at the cross-face leg. You'll know by looking at the other leg, and in particular, the knees. We bring the elbow to the center line. We control the head. We bring our legs up and lock the top lock. I thread my hand through and grab my own thigh. My hand goes inside and I unlock the top lock. Watch my right knee. If my right knee doesn't move, I can't pivot my hips. My whole thing is to take my right knee and point it at my training partner's crotch. That action of turning my knee to the crotch is what enables me to point my left foot forward like so. so that my two lower legs go in the same directions. If my lower legs go in opposite directions, it's so easy for my opponent to pull his elbow free. Only when my two lower legs point in the same directions and my right knee points inwards at the crotch do I have a full arm lock. When he goes to yank out, it's so difficult. And as a result, we quickly put him down. Let's have a look at that again. Understanding this shoulder pivot is one of the great keys to your progress in the Judogatami position. Elbow to center line, step number 1. Head control, step number 2. Top lock, step number 3. Scooping hand, step number 4. Then the critical pivoting off the shoulder. Step number 5. You can tell it's going well because my knee is pointing in at the crotch, enabling me to lock a very, very tight set of wedges around my opponent. Finally, we put the cross-faced leg in place, and then we use it to either finish from here or, preferably, to put him down. Now, why is that pivot such an important point? Why do I put so much weight on that when I'm coaching this position? There's 2 reasons. The first is it creates truly strong wedges around your opponent's head and shoulders. Remember, Judogatami suffers from an obvious problem. All the wedges are open wedges. There's nothing locking them in place. It's not like a triangle has been locked. My feet aren't even crossed here. Open wedges have to be perfectly placed if they're going to be effective, because there's nothing reinforcing them. The second reason has to do with directionality of force. If I push in the wrong directions and I push into my opponent's center of gravity, I'm never going to get top position. I'm always going to have to fight from bottom and try to finish from bottom. But if I position my hips to face the same direction he's facing, I can knock over anybody in the world. So once again, we start off like so. We go in and catch. From here, we lock up. My hands go in. Now, when I make that scoop, look how my right knee turns inwards. My hips are now facing forwards. So that when I go to apply force, I don't apply force into his body weight. I apply force with his body weight. I take him forwards in the direction he was pointing. And in this way, we can get perfect finishing position. Once you understand the nuances of this shoulder pivot, your armbar will immediately become far tighter than it was previously, and a much better sweeping mechanism to put your opponent down on his back, where all the finishes are significantly easier. Now, I'm sure at this stage many of you are aware that I'm a big believer in the idea of dividing my body up into the various instruments that I use to get a given lock to work. And the more you understand about what each part of your body is supposed to be doing at any given time, the more success you're going to have. Earlier today, we looked at Judogatami and we saw whenever we have someone down, we have a cross-face leg and a torso leg. When you work from bottom position with Judogatami, I often talk about what I call a direction leg. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, it provides the directionality of force that makes it easy to put someone down. Let's have a look at this in some detail, because I truly believe this will help you a lot when you get caught underneath people attempting Judogatami. Okay, if I have someone in that closed guard scenario that we looked at earlier, we know step number 1 is always to draw the elbow to the center line. We know that step number 2 is always to control the posture so they can't recover their elbow position. We know that step number 3 is to lock on the top lock so that my hips are glued to his shoulders. When he tries to yank out of here, it's a difficult thing. Now from here, we thread our hand through and get our hand to our own thigh. This leaves us a free hand, which becomes our scooping hand, okay? And it draws my ear to his knee and creates the beginnings of angle. But real angle doesn't happen until the shoulder pivot, which involves me pointing my knee at my training partner's crotch and pointing my left knee into his shoulder. Now, I have two legs here. My right leg is going to be my direction leg. And as the name implies, it points the direction of force. If my foot is pointing in the wrong direction, I'm going to push into his center of gravity. And this is going to be a feeble jujigatami. The whole thing is to get our foot up into the armpit and my toes point the direction of force. When he makes a strong, resistant body, okay, it's that which is going to give me the ability to push forwards. I never want to push up into him. If he stacks me in this position, I'm going to lose the stacking battle. When he stacks me, I want him going forwards. So my direction leg is what counters stacking attempts. Then I just bring my crossface into place. So my direction leg points the way. Crossface controls the head. And it's my direction leg that puts him down. Okay? The direction leg points the way and puts him down in a sweeping action. So here we are. We go through, elbow to center line. Posture control, top lock. Thread the leg in, and there's my direction leg working. Don't fall over, what are you doing? Posturing up and away. From here, look how my foot, as it goes over, points the direction of the sweep. My cross-face leg keeps his head down. If the head rises, you see what it does to my direction leg. It causes a problem. I want my direction leg and my cross-face leg working in unison. If my cross-face leg is weak, the head rises. Now he can start moving his body weight backwards. That's going to create problems. My direction leg points the way forwards. And then from here, we can easily guide him down to the mat. Okay? So that's the direction leg. Now, what about the cross-face leg? How does that function in a jujigatami from bottom position? Its primary goal is to keep my opponent's head down. If your opponent's head rises, that means his shoulder is getting further away from his hips, and that means you are very likely to fail. So the cross-face leg must always heel downwards towards my buttocks, a back heel motion. My heel back towards my own buttocks. I'll show it on this side. Here we are. We take the elbow to the center line. We reinforce it, control the posture, hips out, top lock. My opponent goes in. From here, you can see the initial turn. Now, my direction leg is pointing correctly. When I use the cross-face leg, it's important that my knee goes over the neck. Never try to hook with your ankle and calf. This is inadequate. It will not control your opponent's head. I always make the turn in such a way that my knee, the hollow of my knee, is on top of his neck. And it's that which gives me control. Only now do I control the head. Now, my direction leg points the way, and we put him down to the floor. And we're in a position to start finishing. I cannot overstate the importance of learning how to use those two legs in unity, in concert with each other. The direction leg points the way, and the cross-face leg controls the head. The only way your cross-face leg will adequately control his head is if the hollow of your knee goes over his neck. There's nothing more sad to watch than a feeble cross-face leg where only the calf muscle makes contact with the head. Even worse, people with straight legs. Trying to pull here, the guy yanks his elbow and it's gone every time. Always, what we want in these situations is for the hollow of my knee to go high over my opponent's head so that the back heel brings his head down. Now, any opening of my knee brings his head to the mat. Okay? If my leg is straight, there's no way I'll bring his head to the mat. So I need my knee over, and then I open, and his forehead touches the mat. Then the direction leg completes it by sweeping him over. Okay, let's have a look at all of that in detail. I have two legs, and I must understand how they are used. Once we come in and lock up, there's our top lock. I go in and make the shoulder pivot. My direction leg is pointing the direction of force. Then my cross-face leg comes over and locks high over the top of the neck. That brings his head down. Once his head comes down towards the floor, it's so easy for the direction leg to complete the process and put him down to the mat. And now we're ready to win from here. Learning to use your two legs, the cross-face leg and the direction leg, is an absolutely critical part of your success with Judogatame from supine bottom positions. Now, let's look at how we get the cross-face leg in place. There's a way of doing it which increases your chance of success, and there's a way of doing it which lowers your chance of success. So let's have a look at this. Okay, we've got the Judogatame position. Everything's looking good. We were in closed guard. We brought the elbow to the center line. We went in, we controlled posture. We shifted out, got a good top lock. From here, we went around the corner like so. Now, here's a common problem. From here, I know I'm supposed to bring my leg over and turn it into a cross-face leg. If I bring the leg wide out like so, he can put his hand inside my thigh and I've got no cross-face leg. Or, alternatively, as I bring it out wide, he could just yank his elbow now and pull away. Okay? What went wrong? What went wrong is I pulled my cross-face leg in a wide arc around my opponent's head. That's not what we want. The wider the arc, the easier it is for my opponent to catch my leg or just time my movement and pull his elbow free. What we need is an effective way of taking the cross-face knee from one shoulder to the other shoulder. It doesn't seem like much, but it's heartbreaking when you do good work, almost have the guy in a full Judogatame and then lose it on some small detail like this. Nothing sucks more than that. So let's look at how to transition my cross-face knee from one side to the other in a way that makes sense. Okay, first let's clearly state the problem. We get to the Judo position. I turn and pivot. My left knee is currently on his right shoulder, but to apply a crossface, my left knee needs to be on his left shoulder. The problem is, how are we going to do that? Because the whole time he's looking to catch my leg or time his elbow out of there. So how are we going to do this? The right way to do it is to take my knee, which is currently turned in, and brush my opponent's head. As I brush, I get to the crown of the head, I just fit my foot over and lock it over. I never swing wide. That's a disaster. Okay? Anytime you swing wide, you're giving your opponent everything he needs. So I want to minimize the exposure of my leg to his hands. So I bring it in like so, and just turn it over the top and lock it. And as a result, we put him right down into a winning position. You always want to minimize the arc of your cross-faced leg as it transitions from one shoulder to the other. The less space you give, the more success you're going to have. One more time on this important but small detail. From here, we bring the elbow across. We lock in and lock up the top lock. When he goes to yank out, the top lock is an incredibly strong way of holding someone in place. Now I thread my hand in. Look how my knee is currently on his right shoulder. I turn in, he goes to yank out. It won't be easy. Now, from here, I bring my knee in a tight arc across his forehead so that there's minimal exposure. And when I lock, my knee touches on the other shoulder. So I've gone from one shoulder to the other. Notice always that my left knee is in constant contact with the shoulders on this side and this side. If there is any space between my knee and his shoulders, you got poor wedging in place to stop that. From here, You can see my knee is not on his shoulder. This is going to be a sloppy looking Jujigatami. It's only when my my knee makes contact with the shoulder that we end up with adequate Jujigatamis. Your knee must be in contact with the far shoulder and then transition to the near shoulder. If there's no contact, your Jujigatami is unlikely to succeed on a good opponent. And as you make the transition, if there's space, again, it's very likely he'll escape. When it comes time to attack someone with Jujigatami, there's a broad division which we can make. There are, on the one hand, speed-based methods of Jujigatami, and on the other, control-based methods. If you remember your first ever lessons in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you might have learned something like this. We have an opponent down at the bottom of the mount, and our opponent perhaps rather naively pushes up on our chest, and we do Jiu-Jitsu 101. We put our hands on our training partner, and from here in one motion, seeing an opportunity, we just quickly hop up, throw our legs around the corner and end up in Jujigatami. So this would be a good example of a speed-based method. Okay, there was an opportunity that was there, presumably for a second or two, and we jumped around the corner and got to the move. Okay, from guard position, you might see something like this. Guy has hands on biceps. We bring everything in towards the center, and in one motion, we just throw our legs around the corner and throw our legs up and into a Jujigatami. Okay, and you see these kinds of things demonstrated all the time. Getting more advanced in competition, you might see flying armbars, where two people are in the standing position, one guy just flies straight away into an armbar, and this would be another fine example of a speed-based method. In speed-based methods, there's really just two steps. There's the entry, and then there's breaking. You fly into the move, and then it's time to break your opponent's arm. So it's two steps, very, very quick. This stands in contrast to control-based methods, where there's 4 steps. A good example would be a top lock into Jujigatami, where, say from guard, first we get control of our training partner, and we go through and lock up. A controlling grip here. Okay, so there's an entry which involves bringing the elbow in towards the center line, then a control aspect where we lock up our training partner's shoulder and exert considerable control. Then there's a separation element where we physically separate our training partner's hands so they're no longer resisting us, and then from here we transfer the leg from one side across to the other, and from here we get a strong break. Okay, so you can see there's a lot more steps involved. First step, the setup, usually has to do from this position with elbow towards the center line, and then from here, control, where I lock up my training partner's shoulder. Then the next step will be the transfer from one shoulder to the other of the cross-faced leg, and then the separation of my training partner's arms, and then finally the break. So you see there's considerably more steps involved. In general, I have a strong preference for control-based methods of Jujigatami. The vast majority of this video will be spent looking at control-based methods rather than speed-based methods. That's not to say speed-based methods don't have a place. They do. Surprise is always a tremendous weapon in any form of combat, and Jiu-Jitsu is no exception. If you can surprise someone with a flying armbar, it can be a very, very effective way of attacking. But in truth, surprise doesn't last long. You hit the move a couple of times, your opponent figures it out, and surprise is no longer on your side. That's why in international competition, control-based variations of Jujigatami massively outperform speed-based methods. You see many, many more times do you see control-based methods working at top-level competition for long periods of time in all weight categories by outstanding athletes for years, rather than just highlight reel finishes with speed-based methods. So most of our attention will be spent on these control-based methods. The main element that distinguishes the control-based methods are control of our opponent's shoulder, 2 critical steps. I'll demonstrate it from bottom position, but same thing will be true from various other top positions. The idea of a setup phase, which typically involves bringing the elbow towards the center line. There are other methods from different positions, but that's one of the main ones. Then the idea of controlling our opponent's shoulder in fact, the entire shoulder girdle. So his elbow comes inside my hip. Then we've got to get control of the shoulder girdle. And then transfer our cross-face leg from one shoulder across to the other. Then, because our opponents can see the steps as they're unfolding, he typically goes to defend by locking his arms together. There's going to be a period where we go to untie our opponent's defensive arms, and then from here a final breaking phase where we go in and actually attack our opponent's elbow. That step-by-step procedure, the control-based method, will be our focus, and I want it to be your primary focus as you work hard to master the skills of Judogatami. Yes, there are times where the speed-based method can be highly effective. I'm not asking you to abandon it, but what I am suggesting to you is you spend the vast majority of your training time and skill development in control-based methods. Experience in international competition clearly shows that they outperform, especially in the long run, speed-based methods.